Twin Star War here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Over the past 4 decades, veteran reporter Robert Scheer has built a reputation as one of the leading journalists in this country. From his time as a war correspondent during Vietnam to his widely read columns today. Over the years, he's interviewed Presidents Nixon, Carter, Reagan, and Clinton. He's written 7 books. His latest is hitting bookstores next week. It's called The Pornography of Power: How Defense Hawks Hijacked 9/11 and Weakened America. Robert Scheer is also the editor of truthdig.com. Welcome to Democracy Now! It's good to have you with us. The Pornography of Power. Why pornography?
Because it's not the real thing. It's a trick. It's like, I liken it to a lap dance. You know, you're promising something that doesn't exist. They're promising security. These defense contractors, lobbyists, politicians, they pretend they're dealing with real issues in the world, and they're not. They're just getting your money, and they're deceiving you. And at the end of the day, you wonder, how did I end up in this grimy, dangerous place and forking over ever more money? And it has nothing to do with making me happy. So I use the pornography symbol as an example of what they're doing. And that's really what this hijacking of 9/11 is all about. These guys who did the hijacking, what we do know about it is they used $3 implements that you could buy at Home Depot. They didn't use F-22s, F-35s, they didn't use subs or anything else. So there's no enemy in sight. The military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned us about was in big trouble. George Bush's father had cut the defense budget by 30%. It was going way down. We were finally going to get a peace dividend. And then they jumped over 9/11. They said, wow, this is our new opportunity. Let's dust off all the ships and planes that are no longer needed, and we'll build them now. And we are going deeply into debt, building these things that have absolutely no use. We had this enormous arsenal that, according to the Reaganites, humbled the old Soviet Union. The Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. And we're building, you know, $2.5 billion a piece submarines to fight who? And every once in a while they bring up China, and they're even trouble on that one now, because it turns out that China and Taiwan are getting along quite famously this week, and they're talking about a new chapter of peace. And so we don't even have the China boogeyman anymore. And the idea that you need submarines to go get guys who are in caves in Afghanistan is absurd.
You're right. It costs between $400,000 and $500,000 for Osama bin Laden and his al-Qaeda to pull off the 9/11 attacks, according to the authoritative estimate of the bipartisan 9/11 Commission appointed by President Bush. But within days of the hijacking, Bush demanded 50,000 times that amount, $20 billion in emergency appropriations from Congress.
Right. I think people have trouble. We all know that from school. What's $1,000? What's $1 million? What's $1 billion? And what's $1 trillion? You know, and people have trouble keeping track of the money. But the $20 billion that he got right away, that's nothing. That's nothing. We had a situation where Bush vetoed an extension of child health care that would have involved $7 billion, okay? That's 2 subs that we don't need that are built every year. All right? We have the F-35, an airplane that's a $300 billion program. Why do we need new planes? The F-22, a $65 billion program. So we are wasting trillions of dollars on this old-fashioned defense budget that benefits Boeing, benefits Lockheed. Everyone knows it's a scam. Everyone knows there's no military function for this. There's no national security. And what happened is they got a license to steal. 9/11 was their license to steal.
You wrote that you almost dedicated the book to Richard Nixon. Right. But you didn't.
Yeah, well, no, he was a horrible man, and he killed a lot of people and should have been tried for war crimes. I don't want to exonerate Richard Nixon. But the fact is that Richard Nixon was the enemy of the neoconservatives. Richard Nixon recognized that communism was nationalist, that there was not an international communism. That was the old boogeyman justifying the whole military budget, that we could do business with communist China and with the Soviets. We did. And this is what spawned the neoconservative movement of the Richard Perles and the Wolfsteaders and so forth. And so Nixon recognized that imperialism doesn't pay. that, you know, it's better to buy the oil on the open market than to try to control. Look what's happened. We control the second biggest pool of oil in the world right now in Iraq, and the price of oil is an all-time high. Okay, so what are we getting from it? Meanwhile, there's China that doesn't have oil, and they're going around buying this stuff up. They're acting like modern-day capitalists, these communist Chinese, and we have forgotten. We've returned to a very old-fashioned imperial model. You know, let's have a big army, let's have a big military, let's conquer people, let's occupy them. It's not efficient. And the proof of it really is in the price of gas at the pump. You know, this gas and oil in Iraq was supposed to pay for our occupation. Instead, American consumers are now paying for the oil.
Talk about how Richard Nixon compared to what's happening today. Well,
Richard Nixon on both domestic and foreign policy was a moderate in comparison to George W. Bush. On domestic policy, Richard Nixon, as the old moderate Republican Party of Eisenhower, he entertained a notion of a guaranteed annual income. He favored environmental protection. Again, I don't want to celebrate Richard Nixon, but on domestic policy, the country has moved far right under the current Republican administration. And on foreign policy, Richard Nixon was in favor of détente, which is, as I say, the neoconservatives. That's a movement developed in opposition to détente. And what détente means is we have to get along in a complex world, a multipolar world, and we have to learn to live with people, and we have to learn to, you know, negotiate and not be heavy-handed. And so Richard Nixon really brought about the beginning of the end of the Cold War with his opening to China, Red China, communist China. And the irony now is that when these defense hawks, when they challenge my book and they say, well, of course we don't need these submarines to fight al-Qaeda. They don't even have a rowboat. And of course we don't need, you know, new stealth bombers to fight al-Qaeda. But there's the China menace. The irony is here China is financing our arms development. They are charging us interest to lend us money to build weapons ostensibly to attack them, and they're laughing up their sleeve. They know this is a joke. And meanwhile, as I say, this incredibly important thing happened. The Kuomintang that was kicked out of China, the old Chiang Kai-shek's old group, their party visited China today. They embraced. The whole argument with Taiwan seems to be over. They're going, you know, trade, tourism, they're going to have direct flights now. All of that happened this week. You know, and yet we're building up a military ostensibly when they say, well, we can't really justify going after al-Qaeda with all this fancy equipment. China is coming. And as I point out in the book, last year the Defense Department concluded China is not even a significant regional power. Not even a significant regional power. They are not a challenge to America. We spend, this is a statistic that still, I don't know, I find mind-boggling. I have to keep checking to make sure it's true. We spend more than the rest of the world combined on military. The whole world combined, friend and foe. We spend more, okay? We are spending more now than ever in peacetime America. We are spending more now than we did during the Vietnam War and during the Korean War. To what? To get guys who use $3 box cutters and pen knives? You know, it's absurd. It's an absurd waste of resources. We say we don't have money for the schools. We don't have money for infrastructure. We don't have money to help people with their housing loans. All these things, we don't have money. You look at any social program, and people say, wait a minute, you can't spend that money there. It's not cost effective and so forth and so on. But yet, you know, $300 billion for an F-35 multi-service airplane, $300 billion, and it's not questioned. And I'll tell you, one of the ironies in this election campaign is Hillary Clinton voted for every military expenditure. She loves the military. Democrats have a big problem a lot of times because they want to show they're tough and patriotic and so forth. But John McCain actually distinguished himself in the Senate as being one guy who went after some of these big-ticket weapon systems. Because of John McCain, the top procurement officer at the Pentagon went to jail. The COO of Boeing went to jail. This was, you know, over scams that were conducted. So John McCain, as a senator, actually